We just looked at column concatenation, and you may think to yourself, okay, I understand what it does. So we select employee number, we select concat of the first and last name, and we rename it. But what is it exactly that we just did here? Well, let's answer that question. When we call concat, what we are calling is a function. And so you may ask yourself, what is a function? Well, a function is nothing more than something that takes an input and generates an output. Now let me take that a step back. When we gave it first and last name, what we were doing was we were giving it the parameters that it was supposed to take in, right? First name, last name. And then the function is named concat. So the name tells you what it's going to do. So by giving it the input parameters, first name and last name, and telling it to put a space in between there. So we're telling it, okay, concatenate the first name, concatenate this space, and then concatenate the last name. We're telling it to run that function called concat. So it takes very specific input parameters and it will concatenate them together. It will put them in a sequence beside each other. So we run that function, we run that function, we run that function, and we run it against each individual row. So each individual row is being concatenated. It's not like we're taking all of the data and concatenating it in one long string. No. We're running it against each and every row. And so the output of that is what we saw. And that is basically what a function does. So when we think about functions, right, we always have to look at the name of the function because that's going to tell you what it's going to do. And then the next part is, well, what kind of inputs does it take? And so once we figure that out, we can know what to give it. And once we know what to give it, when you run your query, well, that function is going to run, and then you're going to have an output. All right, so now that we understand that, you may ask yourself, well, okay, we saw concat, but what other type of functions are there? Okay, let's give a function a definition. Let's define what a function is. A function is a set of steps that creates a single value. All right, so we just talked about the fact that when you give a function input parameters, it's going to generate an output. So we gave it first name, space, last name. All right, we gave it the input parameters and we called concat, and it's going to produce a single value called full name. It's as simple as that. So now that we know what a function is and we've defined what it is, you may ask yourself, well, what type of functions are there? And so you have two types of functions. You have aggregate functions and you have scalar functions. All right, I can see your head spinning being like, aggregate, scalar, what do these words mean? They're simpler than they sound. Aggregate functions aggregate data. So they take all of the data, they take everything, and they produce one single value. Think of it like having a column of salaries and then wanting to calculate the total amount of salaries that you're paying out. Well, then we would run a sum, right? We would do all of the salaries plus each other and we would get there. That's aggregating all of the salaries together to generate an output. That's one example of an aggregate function. And then on the other end, you have scalar functions. And what scalar functions do is what concat did. They run against each individual row. So what they do is you give them the inputs and they're going to run that function against each individual row of data. So you get multiple outputs, right? When we concatenate the names, we see each and every individual's name concatenated. We don't have one long list of one concatenated name of everyone, right? So that's what scalar functions do. They run against each individual row. So to summarize, aggregate functions run against all of the data and produce one output. Scalar functions run against each individual row. So if we were to summarize that in a definition, aggregate functions operate on many records to produce one value. So again, we're taking all of the values in the table and we're producing one value, just like that salary example. What we can say then is that it produces a summary. It produces an output. So an example of this would be, well, you have all of these salaries and you want to select the total amount of salaries that you pay. So we have 100, 250, and 50. So 50 plus 50 is 100, plus 200 is 300, plus 100 is 400. So we would know that our salary total is 400. And so that's what an aggregate function is going to do. It's going to produce that one output. If we looked at scalar, the non-aggregate functions, well, they operate on each record independently. So what does that mean again? Well, that's kind of like our concat. If we look at it more closely, we have a table that has Mo Bini and Andre Nagoy. First name, last name. So if we were to, for instance, concatenate the name like we did, we see that the function runs on each individual record. We're not producing one output. We're producing multiple outputs. And that's what scalar or non-aggregate functions do. So now that we've taken a closer look at functions, and now that you know the difference between the different types of functions, we can now categorize more easily what type of functions we're working with. Because with that foundation, what we basically gain here is the knowledge to look at a function and know what it's going to produce. See, there are so many functions in SQL, and we could spend months and months trying to hit every single one of them. But what we want to give you here is the foundation to be able to look at a function and see if it will fit into what you're trying to do, and to understand that you have aggregate functions versus non-aggregate functions gives you that basis to look at something and be like, well, I need this to run on each individual record, or I need to produce one output. And then you can go and you can figure out the best way to do that.